welcome. I'm Sam Faddis. This is Ann Magazine's Ground Truth, and today we're talking about the intelligence community, state of it, problems, where we go from here. This is the first of two segments we're going to do. Today's going to sort of be the what's wrong segment, and then we'll get to, in the second part, how we fix it. With us to illuminate the issues, Bradley Johnson, who is a man of many parts, a retired CIA operations officer, former chief of station. In other words, he was the boss of CIA operations in particular countries. Ran the PIFWIC program for a while, which basically means he hunted war criminals, a counterintelligence expert, surveillance detection expert, etc. These days, Mr. Johnson is a columnist for the Epoch Times and a regular on One America News Network. Welcome, sir.
Sam, great to be with you. Thank you so much.
So, you heard me intro this segment. I'd like to kind of start here. For the last 3 years, we've seen, in my opinion, some really unprecedented and really troubling actions by folks associated with the intelligence community. And I'm not tarring the entire intelligence community by any stretch of the imagination, filled with thousands of men and women doing God's work every day. But we've seen some folks at some very senior levels involved in political activity that I find very disturbing and very dangerous. What's your perspective on what we've seen over the last few years?
I think that's absolutely correct. What's happened is that over time, the entire leadership and pipeline into leadership has been taken over by a very hardcore liberal cadre that it's politics first and the business of the nation second. And now, from their perspective, they view what's good for liberalism as the business of the nation, but it just simply is not. And it almost always diverges right away, and their allegiance is to that political goal rather than the Constitution of the United States and the protection of the national security interests of the United States. So it's something where we now see it. It's become very visible because President Trump was elected. President Trump is an outsider, so he's not liked by many Republicans as well. So he doesn't really have within government any cadre of people that are specifically trying to help him. And he's got a great connection to the people of the United States of America. But that's not who necessarily. You don't have that kind of crosscut within government. Government is an odd little thing, and having you, as you have done as well, having come out of 25 years of living and working in the swamp, it gives me a lot of perspective on how it works. And the vast majority of people in government have never done anything else but work in government. It's a very small percentage of people. And it was something for me. Now, I actually came out of banking before I went to work at the CIA. So I'm damn near unique in the operations field at any rate, having had quite a few years of banking under my belt before going into the government. So a lot of the things that were done were just immediately apparent to me as very quirky and odd, and the way the rules were set up and all that. So for President Trump, it's a big transition, and a lot of the people there aren't even trying to help him. So, but back to the central question of it, with leadership at the IC, the intelligence community being what it is, they're more looking for opportunities to damage President Trump, his reputation, or whatever they can do. I mean, with the ultimate goal, hopefully, of overturning the election and getting rid of him. But I think they recognize that that's just not going to happen anymore. So what they're doing is looking for ways to damage. I think certainly what we've seen with these so-called whistleblowers, these are all inside people, part of the intelligence community, well known to the leadership of the intelligence community. And in case any of your listeners have any doubt, most of the people working in the National Security Council, which is the White House intelligence staff, more or less, very loose description of it, but those people all come from someplace else. They come from the Pentagon, or they'll come from the CIA, or they'll come from the FBI, or they'll come from NSA. They come from different agencies and they get sent there. Now, those were the people. There was a furious hiring frenzy to fill those slots plus many more that weren't funded and so on at the end of Obama administration. So the NSC was jam-packed with those people, that particular type of person. And so Trump has been very slow to move to change that. So you've got these people that were really handpicked out of the agencies, out of the leadership of the IC, to be these politically reliable people from their perspective. And that's where we see people like the Vendeman twins and people like that, and why they've been in position in contact with other, liberal staffers on the Hill that have come out of that same background and are friends. And that's why we see these intelligence operations put together and run against the president. The president, not being of that world, doesn't understand really what he's seeing. Now, that is beginning to shift. And we've seen someone sent in temporarily to take over the Director of National Intelligence chair. It's a temporary fill. Someone permanent will be put in, and he's removed a number of people. And I think we're going to see that continue. I think the president has now kind of figured this out, seeing that this isn't a group of people that are his friends. And there are a lot of things I would point out that are just clear indicators of what we really have in the intelligence community. And let me just use one example that just stinks to high heaven, and that's every 4 years, essentially every time a new president or a president wins a new election. It may be a second term for president or a first term, either way. Every 4 years, there's a document that the strategy analysis that the intelligence community as a whole puts out. The last one came out in 2017, January 9th, if I recall correctly. And that was, when President Trump assumed office. And in that, if you just go down and read the whole thing, which for your listeners' benefit, I've tortured myself by doing that. I've gone through the whole thing. And if you look and compare, global warming is featured far more, with a lot more emphasis in that, than terrorism. Now, this is something that's supposed to be an analysis of global threats going out 5 to 20 years, and global warming is the focus of the intelligence agencies and the IC over terrorism. Let me say, which I would argue strenuously, have a lot of data to show that global warming is a complete hoax and falsehood, and there's little to no evidence of any kind that even supports a theory for global warming. But even if it's true, even if you believe in global warming or believe that any part of it is true, that's still not where the intelligence community needs to be active. That's not where the intelligence community resources and efforts need to be spent or expended. And that being a higher priority, clearly, as by reading through this quadrennial report, indicates by so much emphasis on global warming, you can see that it's a higher priority to those people than terrorism, which, terrorism kills people. We've all seen where cars and trucks have gone out on a bridge and just run over innocent random people, and how a guy with an axe or a knife will go on the subway or out on the streets where there's a crowd of people and just start randomly killing people. Now, that is where the intelligence community needs to spend its effort and time, and not on global warming. So in pollution and any of those sorts of things, there's many ways to fight those if you're a strong believer that those are an important priority. But it should not be in the intelligence community. So you just see the priorities and the understanding of how the world really works, where priorities should be, the importance of certain topics compared to others from an intelligence, national security perspective, is just not understood by these people. They do not understand how the business actually works, because they're apparatchiks, they're politicians, they're people that have worked on the Hill as bureaucrats and all of these sorts of things. And if you look as a whole, I would say one of the weaknesses that we have is so few operators are actually put into positions of managing operational activity. It's mostly as I say, the term I like is the Roswell and the apparatchiks. The bureaucrats are the ones that run everything. And beautiful case in point is the 9/11 Commission. And if you look at the list of who was, now this was President Bush's time following 9/11. If you look at who was brought onto that commission, they were all basically people I'm describing, lawyers and academics and politicians were brought on there, all bureaucrats in essence. Not one person on that was a professional operator, not in law enforcement operations, not in military operations, not in intelligence operations, not one. And so what do you get? What you get is this ginormous report that proposes a whole bunch of bureaucracy as a solution to terrorism, which anyone in the operations field of any kind, law enforcement, military, intelligence, we all looked at that one. Good God, this is going to make it worse, not better. And that's in fact what we've seen. If you had taken that same number of people commissioned and had all people that had 20, 25 years, 30 years of operations under their belt, I guarantee you the report at the end of that would have been much different. It would focus on how do you actually destroy terrorism versus how do you build a bureaucracy so you can say you're doing something against terrorism. So this whole thing is all just swung out of control. It's very, very, very political. Everything that we see out of them is political in nature, and no longer do we have the priority, the interests of the American people at heart out of the IC. And now I do reiterate, Sam, what you said, and that is that there are a lot of very good people, many of them friends of mine, I'm sure friends of yours, that are still in the intelligence community doing their job. And at the working level,
Absolutely.
Yeah, the average person is just a normal person doing a normal job that understands that they have respect for the Constitution of the United States. They have respect for our way of life. They want to do what's best for national security. But as soon as they start to move up, that just starts to evaporate. And that, as I mentioned earlier, alluded to that pipeline to leadership has long been controlled by liberals. And to get into that, if you're not part of the old boys network, which in their case, they welcome women in too, it's just the old gang network, I guess would be the better term. But if you're not part of that liberal cadre, liberal perspective, I've seen it happen directly many, many times. You just do not get the jobs that will catapult you into leadership. You're moved aside into other jobs, and those jobs are reserved for their own people. And in government now, there's a lot of control over how people get promoted, and it's colorblind and all those. So you can't see who the person is or judge them based on race, creed, religion, all of those sorts of things. So there's very tight controls on those promotions, but there's zero control, and it's 100% manipulated in the system as to who gets what job. There are zero controls over that. So that is 100% manipulated by leadership so that only their crew gets into those jobs. And that's what gets those people into that leadership pipeline. So it's truly a mess. And what we've seen now is just the tip of the iceberg, and it's only floated to the surface because of President Trump, because they're taking so many actions to try and destroy President Trump. Underneath it all, that's much worse than anyone I think most people would appreciate without talking about it in more detail. And just the depth it goes to and the breadth it goes to is really alarming and something certainly that needs to be corrected. And hopefully some of these changes that we're seeing out of President Trump and the people now that he's bringing in and the beginning of recognition of this as an issue, hopefully, and the odds are he's going to be reelected. So hopefully over the next 5 years, we're going to start to see the swamp get drained and some of this be cleaned up. And I don't think it's something that President Trump will be able to accomplish in 5 years, but certainly he can chip away at it and make some positive differences.
Yeah, you've hit on so many really great points there. I mean, I think the average American, maybe only now, after having observed what's going on over the last 3 years, is beginning to appreciate so much of what you said. I mean, to begin with, you kind of have this common sense idea that the president gets elected and he appoints X number of cabinet secretaries. And from that point on, the president's in control of the government, and the government should be doing what the president tells it to do. And as you've pointed out very eloquently, no, we have a vast, unbelievably large army of bureaucrats, what I call mandarins, but your term is is good too, who don't believe that they are required to follow the dictates of the president. In fact, to the contrary, apparently believe that it's their complete right to oppose him. I was at a meeting the other day down in D.C., and a guy was talking about how he had just driven into CIA headquarters, and as he's going through one of the gates there, the car in front of him has a bumper sticker on it that says resist, which of course is code for opposing the President of the United States. So here's somebody who is apparently a staff officer at Central Intelligence Agency driving to work and believes that it is their right to actively oppose the president. It also resonates very much with me, what I would call sort of the defanging or deprofessionalization of the intelligence community. Man, both you and I are former operations officers, so our job is to run operations and recruit sources. And yet, if I was to walk around Washington, D.C., it seems like every other person I meet will tell me he's an intelligence officer, and yet none of them have actually ever recruited sources or run operations. They sit behind desks in Washington, and they're not analysts either. They are just what you referenced is bureaucrats. When I came on in the agency, it seemed to me that the leadership was composed largely of crusty old guys who drank too much and probably weren't particularly great husbands or fathers because they spent all their time working. But they had spent 30 years in all the dusty, dangerous places of the world. And that whole cast of characters seems to be either gone, or if they exist, they're not in leadership anymore.
Well, I would say, this was told to me by someone who's still working at the agency, an active person who's now gotten to the age where they're kind of in the leadership roles, and just made a comment in passing, but it stuck with me. And their comment was that anybody good is gone. And I think that's the absolute truth across the board. And let me say this, I would include the FBI and much of the military now, and most assuredly the CIA, that basically everybody good is gone. And now this was a long time coming. It was a pattern that had developed certainly under even, I think Jimmy Carter kind of started the ball rolling in that direction. And it was pretty well consolidated during the Clinton years, and then absolutely finished off and fully completed under Obama. And I would specifically refer back to former CIA Director John Brennan, who bragged on NPR in an interview there that essentially he had done away with operations, that now, we use other methods, but we no longer are out at, conducting unilateral espionage. Let me just explain that a little bit. I know, Sam, you're familiar with it, but by unilateral, what I'm referring to is only we would know. So as a CIA operator, the recruitment that Sam mentioned earlier would be out in some other country looking for an individual who has access to that country's secrets that we want to know. Like if they're making any plans against the United States, or if they're involved in corruption, narcotics, human smuggling, whatever it is, we would want to know what is their corruption, what are their secrets, what are they trying to do against the interests and national security of the United States of America. So that was that espionage aspect, and only we would know. And nowadays, this has continued ever since the Obama days when John Brennan was director. He moved to a position where we rely exclusively on our, what they now call foreign partners, our overseas partners. So the objective now, and the way operations are done, is they'll go out and say to X country, we need a reporting source on this stuff over here. And X country will go, yeah, sure, I got somebody for you. And, as many times as not, it's their brother-in-law. They don't report that. And this brother-in-law gets paid, so they split the money. And this, whoever the original person is you asked, will feed them information. There's a lot of corruption built into it. But inherently, it is absolutely backwards, wrong way to go in the intelligence field, because then that is a bilateral or perhaps multilateral way of conducting espionage. And what I mean by that is that host country is aware of the case. Now, that's built to not work, because most countries, you have other intelligence agencies working against them as well. So this other country we've gone to and asked for a reporting source, prove to me the Chinese don't have them penetrated. Prove to me the Russians don't have them penetrated. So prove to me that those guys aren't aware of our case. And if they're aware of our case, they can manipulate it. They can feed us false information, all sorts of things to manipulate what we consider intelligence. So that's not unilateral espionage. So while there is a place in the world for that sort of thing, that should not be where our efforts go. And nowadays, the people that are there don't even understand the difference. Most of those guys wouldn't understand. The active duty, what are called operations officers today, wouldn't understand the explanation I just gave. They would disagree because they don't know enough about it to know what to do or say. It's a pity, this degradation in our capabilities. I would add one more thing too on it that you mentioned earlier about these people feel that they can have this resist on their bumper sticker. By the way, in the hallways of all of these federal agencies, that's common. I mean, it's the rule, not the exception. And people in the lunchrooms and walking down the hall when Trump was elected, they were all saying, "Oh, we've got to figure out how to resist." And there are exceptions, but the closer you get to leadership, the fewer there are. And so the people who talk that way are perfectly open about it and are able to say these sorts of things openly. And anyone who thinks differently just has to keep their head down and their mouth shut, because if you openly come out and say, "Look, you guys, that are saying you need to resist the president of the United States, you're freaking traitors. You're traitors to the national security of the United States of America. You don't belong in here with a clearance." And just kind of point of order on all of this, when Trump sent Vindman back to the Pentagon, now he was one of the guys that testified against Trump on these charges that were just ridiculous in every way with no facts to back them up. He gets sent back to the Pentagon and makes a comment, and he's Army, and made a comment to the effect that this guy should be investigated. The very next day, the chief of the Army, and I forget his name right now, but the head of the Army made a comment that Vindman is not going to be investigated. Now, I was never in the military, but I've worked with them for decades, so have basic understanding of how particularly the Army works. But for the chief of the Army to come out and publicly state, the president says yesterday we need to investigate Vindman, and the chief of the Army comes out and says, "Ain't gonna happen, boss. We're not doing it," publicly. Now, for Trump, he just went on. He didn't really react to that because he views it as most civilians would, is like, yeah, okay, whatever. But for the Army, in the military as a whole, for that guy to stand up the very next day and say, "We're not going to do it," is absolutely spitting in President Trump's face. Now, President Trump, like I said, he doesn't understand that and doesn't view it. But everybody in the military does. Everybody understands exactly what that was. That guy was spitting in President Trump's face, directly, publicly, openly, in front of all to see. And now Trump, unfortunately, not understanding the swamp, like I said, just didn't view it that way, doesn't view it that way now. But he should have fired that guy the same day. And if he'd have been in a real estate deal where he was building a building and talking to all the unions and had a massive meeting with all the unions and his employees there and all of those people, that would have been something where he would have fired that guy right on the spot. The guy would have been escorted out of the building. So Army Secretary Ryan McCarthy, that's it. That was the guy that made the comment. So he's the head of the Army within Joint Chiefs. So that was the guy that said we're not going to do it. That's the guy that President Trump should have fired right on the spot. And unfortunately, like I said, he doesn't understand what happened there, and so hasn't responded appropriately. But I don't think he understands the bureaucracy and swamp very well, which God bless him for that. I can't criticize anyone for that. But one of the weaknesses that happens is this sort of thing where those things are allowed to go unpunished. And as the head of the military, as the president of the United States, this guy works for him. And he has every right that everybody in the military would also understand. Is like, oh, okay, you want to go up against me? Well, I'm president. You're not. I invite you to succeed elsewhere. And that's what should have happened that has not. And Sam, I hope you're able to, bring in the president to listen to this interview. That would be my first recommendation for him is to go act on that. And that then puts you in charge. When you have this type of insubordination within the military, this does not bode well. This isn't what you need within the military. You need more coherence and the willingness to, obey orders and to salute and and keep this thing running smoothly. When you have that type of open insubordination, it's something that you just can't tolerate. Whether that guy's right or wrong in his argument, if he believes something so strongly, his duty is to retire. Leave, resign over it. It's not to stand up and publicly fight with the president over it. So,
yeah, absolutely.
It's something we'll see. We'll see how that goes forward.
I mean, the president is constitutionally the commander-in-chief, so he is sort of the general of all generals. And you reference Vindman. I mean, at some point before Vindman testified, Vindman was told, the president of the United States told Vindman he didn't want him to testify. So he's a serving active duty lieutenant colonel who the commander-in-chief just told not to appear on Capitol Hill. He appears on Capitol Hill and sits down and wears his uniform, and then makes a very strong point of demanding to be referred to as lieutenant colonel. When I saw that, I thought, okay, I don't really understand at all what I'm seeing. If you are here as a private citizen and your claim is that this doesn't have anything to do with your military duties, and therefore the president can't command you not to be here, then you should be sitting here in a suit as Mr. Vindman. You can't sit here as Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, a serving active duty officer, in defiance of the orders of the commander-in-chief, and sort of have it both ways. You made reference much earlier, the beginning of this, to how President Trump is he's not a Democrat, but he's certainly not a traditional Republican either. And one of the implications when we're talking about this whole business with this vast bureaucracy is that, if a Democratic president comes in and they have to fill literally thousands of spots, appointments, the Democratic Party basically has what amounts to a team on deck, folks that have served in previous administrations and so forth. And they can come up with those appointments relatively rapidly. And the Republican establishment would have the same thing. All these guys that used to serve under the second George Bush, etc. Trump arrived in Washington not only not knowing the swamp, never having worked in D.C., but with no such Rolodex. So, he came in with a handful of guys, and somebody told me the other day that maybe now, after impeachment has crashed and burned 3 years into this, we're finally going to see the first days of the Trump administration, was their point. Now, finally, 3 years into this, clear of this, and now understanding the swamp, only now are we really going to see Donald Trump begin to actually appoint his larger team in Washington, D.C.
Well, that's very aptly laid out and absolutely correct. The president just has only now begun to figure all of this out. Now, and I'm probably misphrasing that a little bit, because it's not so much that he didn't have it figured out, because he'd been told by many people, and very publicly for example, Rush Limbaugh has talked about how he told the president of the United States, look, these guys are, they're all going to hate you forever. There's nothing you can do about it. But the president of the United States, I think he honestly believed that he was going to come in and show everyone that he's honestly trying to do what he believes is best for the nation, and that he would convince people to come over and help him. He thought he was going to have Democrats kind of fall into line and Republicans fall into line, and that he didn't need his own cadre, because everyone would see that he's genuinely trying to do the right thing. While they may disagree over an element here or there, they would see that the common goal, where we should all work together, is that doing what's best for the nation. But that goes back to one of my earlier points, that that's not the case with any socialist philosophy, which liberals today are clearly socialist. It's politics first. They view everything through this prism of everything is political, every decision. And that's why you even see in the educational system, they don't have economic education. You don't get a degree in economics. And like AOC, she says, she got a degree in economics, but she does not. She has a degree in political economics. She has a socialist education in so-called economics, which brings in their political will into it. For example, if a town over here has unemployment, well, then we should just force company X to put a plant there so that there's more jobs for it. Now, that doesn't take into account any of the economic factors. How far away is from its sources that it needs to produce whatever the product is. How far away is it transportation wise from where its product gets sold? All of those things are ignored because it's political economics. Now, real economics, you would take all those things into account. You want whatever the sources are, you need to build your product as close as possible, as cheap as possible. You want your production in an area where you have educated people that you need to produce whatever it is. You want to be as close to your market as you can, so that all of your transportation costs and product costs are as low as possible, so that you sell and make the greater profit. But that has nothing whatsoever to do with political economics, and that's why we see people like AOC, which is unfortunately all too common, out there promoting some of these economic ideas they have, which are based on political, gee, wouldn't this be nice sort of philosophy versus anything real. So the whole thing is just unusual, and the president has been kind of trapped into this thought of showing everyone that he's trying to do the right thing, thinking they'll come around. Well, and I think now that light has finally gone off in his head, where he sees it's just never going to happen, and the depth that these people will sink to, like all of the things that you just pointed out about the Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. He doesn't view the national security and the Constitution of the United States the same way that people like ourselves, who are actual patriots, view it. And so that gives them this excuse because their politics are more important. And it's a real problem. Now, how much the president can do, as I said earlier, it remains to be seen. But certainly I think he's now got an inkling of what needs to be done. And I think it's going to begin. It has begun with the new appointment, at least temporary appointment, to the D&I chair. So hopefully we'll see a permanent guy come in. The names I've seen being bandied about for a permanent solution, and I think they have, or a permanent nominee, don't look good to me. I know a couple of them personally, and they're the bureaucratic apparatchik, former politicians and things like that are not going to be a solution. If the president doesn't bring in an operator, somebody who actually understands how to do things versus how to sit in an office and read about it and pontificate over it and being, the political bureaucrat reaction to it, if he doesn't pick somebody who's got that operational background, then we're just not going to see a lot of change. And I'm not sure that concept is one that he's fully absorbed yet. So we'll see. I think this is going to be a great indicator as to who he selects to sit in Director of National Intelligence chair, and we'll get a good measure of what's coming based on that.
Well, Brett, we're going to leave it there for today because I think that's a perfect ending to kind of laying out the problem. And in our second segment, we will pick up and kind of dive into the weeds on how to get back to the days where we know how to conduct espionage and we stop trying to overturn the President of the United States. So I want to thank you for being with us today.
Sam, thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time on Ground Truth.